Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Sunny Vanderstar. Today's topic is Wildflower Wonders Behind the Camera in Yellowstone, and it will be presented by our fabulous NatHab expedition leader, Charlie Reinertsen. Charlie, thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited for this. Let's go ahead and dive in.
Thanks, Sunny, and welcome everyone. I'm calling in from Adirondack Park, and it's a unseasonably warm day here. It hit 60 degrees, which is pretty unheard of. And just to give you a little sense of the weather in this area, we're going to drop down to 5 degrees overnight. So huge swings. The wildlife are definitely having a hard time adjusting to this new weather pattern. And For me personally, I'm thinking a lot about the amphibians and frogs, toads, salamanders as we head into the spring season. And I'll flag it at the end of this chat, but I have a couple talks coming up about the big night migration that will be happening maybe sooner than we think. But today's chat is about wildflowers. And we're going to take a look in particular at the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Really, this is a very intro discussion about what wildflowers you might find in that area, as well as kind of when to plan your trip if this is something that you're really interested in seeing when you're in that area. In addition, we'll wrap up the chat today with looking at the itinerary that Natural Habitat Adventures has in this region, discovering Yellowstone and Grand Teton. My background, I'm a science communications professional, and I've worked in science communications in a lot of different capacities, initially as an educator with K through 12, and then also high school and college outdoor courses. And then that kind of led into a career of doing science communications for a number of different organizations and companies. And currently I work for my own company, Two Line Studio, and I do a lot of communications and marketing for outdoor businesses as well as conservation groups. And with that, I've had the flexibility to be able to get back into guiding, which has been absolutely amazing. And I've been doing that with Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund. And if you're here, you probably know some about these two companies and organizations. And the reason why I love guiding with NatHab is that it has this incredible partnership with World Wildlife Fund where the travel is really thoughtful and thinking about ways to reinvigorate local communities and find ways to make sure that the travel that you do with this company is helping to take care of the ecosystems that you're traveling within. So the trips that I guide with NatHab include the Canyons trip, the Grand Teton and Yellowstone Wildlife Safari that we'll talk about today. And I've also guided for the wildlife or the monarch butterfly migration in Michoacan, Mexico. And those trips are all absolutely phenomenal. And if you want to ask a few questions at the end about any of those, I'd be happy to answer any questions. But today we're going to dive deeply into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I lived in Grand Teton National Park for a few years, and this ecosystem is just absolutely stunning. And people really think about it and visit it because of its vast wild landscapes, the charismatic megafauna that call it home, from the bison and the elk and the moose to the wolves. Just the list goes on and on. And then it's also these incredible geothermal features that you primarily find in Yellowstone National Park, but that you also find some hot springs down in Grand Teton. And today in particular, we're going to chat about something that people spend a little bit less time on, but it's equally exciting, and that is the wildflower activity that you can see in this area. So let's start with where and when. In Grand Teton National Park, the low elevation areas, which is basically where you spend all of your time on a NatHab trip, the wildflowers really start to hit their peak in June. So if you're really interested in seeing wildflowers in Grand Teton National Park, I'd plan a trip in June for the valley floor. With that said, elevation has a lot to do with where these flowers are blooming and just the weather of that given year. So you can have beautiful wildflower viewing in the valley floor from June through July. And then as the season progresses, the wildflower bloom moves up in elevation. So as that snow melts out of the higher elevation areas, then you get these high alpine meadows. And those areas we don't see as much of on the Natural Habitat Adventures tour. But if you did spend a couple extra days in Grand Teton, you might be able to go on some hikes in July and August into some areas to be able to see some beautiful alpine meadows. And then the other interesting thing is that in Yellowstone, it tends to be a little bit delayed. So the wildflowers that you see in Grand Teton, if you go into Yellowstone, it might be a couple weeks behind in terms of what flowers you're seeing at that given time. But June, again, is a beautiful time to be there. And the other thing to highlight too is that there's really no bad time to be there if you're looking for flowers, because September, October also has the fall bloom with some of the late bloomers coming into play, like goldenrod. Now, what's the importance of flowers, right? So just thinking a little bit about the flower life cycle. Flowers are used as a reproductive method for these plants, and they also provide a really important food source for a lot of wildlife. So a lot of the conversation today that we'll have, the stories that we'll look at, will really be investigating, okay, here's a cool flower and what wildlife species relies on this at a certain point in its life cycle. The other thing that plants do broadly is they help create soil, and there are some plants in particular that do a really good job of increasing the amount of nutrients in the soil, and they play a really important ecological role. And then beyond that, there are all kinds of pollinator species that rely on the nectar of flowers, and plants can also provide a good amount of erosion control. So just that root system gives a little bit more structure to riverbanks and to different areas so that you have less erosion during flooding events, which are becoming more and more common. So this is more and more important. Just looking just a little bit, and again, today's chat, we're going to talk about photography of flowers. A lot of these pictures are ones that I've taken, almost all of them. So different tips that I have for how to do really nice flower photography. But we're also going to kind of brush the history of flowers generally. So why are plants flowering to begin with? Plants are flowering so that they can help pollinate one another, so they can reproduce. And that process of pollination, just like all sexual reproduction, is recombining genetics, right? So that you can create a unique individual. And that recombination is really important because it allows for genetic diversity. And so plants, a lot of them have the ability to simply send up a new shoot of a genetic clone of themselves to self-propagate. But through the process of pollination, it is allowing two unique individuals to combine their DNA and create a new individual. And that is an evolutionarily very beneficial thing, right? So it allows plants to have a greater genetic diversity, which ultimately leads to more resilience in the face of change. So the other aspect of this is that pollination, that can occur a lot of different ways. Some flowers rely on wind to pollinate, so they have these feathery structures on the pollen that allows it to disperse through just wind. Some flowers rely on mammals, where they're transferring that pollen onto a mammal or an insect, a pollinator essentially, to be able to transfer that pollen to another flower. And then we also have different strategies of flowers. So some flowers have a strategy where they want to attract any old pollinator, whether it's a bat, an insect, a bug of any kind, or they're more specialist. So in the case of some plants like orchids, they might cater towards one particular insect. And then there are some really interesting plant structures that come from that, where the plant is trying to be as attractive as possible to that specific pollinator. And the pollinator has some adaptations as well that have allowed it to take advantage of that plant as well as it can. So just without going too deeply into all of that, it's just kind of a refresher to remind ourselves of why are we seeing these amazing things in the natural world. And when we're looking at all of these different structures that flowers can have, it helps us kind of get grounded in the idea that everything that we see is there for a reason, whether it's to promote wind pollination, animal pollination, or insect. When it comes down to identifying plants, a few things can be really, really helpful in the field. And I was putting this presentation together. I even had this idea to do this presentation because we're at that point in the year where we're getting a little bit of spring fever, and it might be time to start thinking about, spring coming and flowers coming. So uh, this is a great time of year to get some new books to be able to set yourself up for when these flowers do come. So one thing that's really helpful is to start to learn some basic flower anatomy. And I put in this graphic because it kind of highlights some very simple flower structures that when you're going through a guidebook, it'll say, this flower has 5 petals and it has a sepal that has 4 divisions, right? So if you start to understand the nomenclature, you'll be able to start to identify the flowers a lot more easily. So one of the tools that's really helpful for plant ID in the field is called a dichotomous key. And essentially, it's like if you've ever read a book that has a jump to page 343 if you want the character to go through the door on the left. So it's a choose your own adventure book. It's kind of like that, but for identifying flowers. And so on a dichotomous key, you'll open it up and it will say, does your flower have 5 petals? Turn to page 3. And then you'll go through a series of questions that'll ultimately lead you down to species level to be able to tell you this is what you're looking at. Those are the most accurate ways to identify flowers, but it's also not always the most fun for everyone because you do have to learn some of the anatomy of a flower. For other people, you might be more interested in guidebooks, and I pulled a couple here. If you are going to Grand Teton and Yellowstone, one of the books that's really helpful is by Kurt Johnson, and I'll put this in the chat later, but it's called Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, a Far Country Field Guide. And what I like about this one is that it's got really beautiful pictures, and there's a spread like this that just shows you divided by color all the different flowers in the ecosystem. And it is divided by, like I said, by color, and then it tells you the page number of each one. Even with this, it can be challenging, but then you get into the actual species, and this guidebook doesn't have a ton of information, but it at least will give you a couple tidbits, and it will give you what you're looking at pretty easily. And it's just limited to the really common species that you're going to encounter in that area. Another one that's really specific to Grand Teton and Yellowstone is Richard J. Shaw's Wildflowers of Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. This one I like because it has a little bit more information about each species. Again, this is a pretty common thing when it comes to flower ID books. It's organized by color. So as you flip through, you've got, you can just flip generally to the color of the flower that you're looking at and then drill down to the species. So those are a couple good things. The next thing that's been pretty amazing is just all of the applications on our phones that allow us to identify flowers really easily and plants generally. So I've had a lot of success with Seek and iNaturalist, but there are a lot of different apps out there. Just try them out. Essentially, you just open up the app, you show it the flower, you take a picture, and then it automatically tells you the species that you're looking at. With that said, nothing will beat, I think, the books, and especially the dichotomous key for accuracy, because every once in a while you will get misidentification using the applications on your phone. Also, just from a memory standpoint, if you're really trying to learn, I've always found that when I've used my phone, I'm much less likely to remember that plant. I have to do something else, look it up in a book or read something about it to really lock it in. So with that, I'd love to just launch into talking about a few of the flowers that you might find in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And when we're talking about the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, I should have put in a map picture, but we're really talking about the area surrounding Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone National Park, and then it's much, much more broad than that in the Rocky Mountains. So it's a really arid area. There's a lot of elevational change in this area, so some of these species are not located at every elevation. Some of them are adapted to the alpine environment. But this one in particular, you might know it, is the pasque flower. This is an early spring bloomer, and this is something that will come up in those guidebooks. Especially in the dichotomous key, it will ask you, does the flower have pubescence or hairs? And in this case, the pasque flower absolutely does. And in particular, if you're looking closely here, you're seeing that there are hairs both on the petals and on the sepals. The sepal is that exterior leaf-like structure around the petals. And that, in this case, with the pasque flower, those hairs provide a little bit of insulation in the cold weather. So once you have hairs, it breaks up the boundary layer around that plant and allows the surrounding air to heat up around it. So it's like wearing a coat. And in addition to that, it also helps protect against herbivory. So other insects or animals might be less inclined to eat this because there are those hairs getting in the way. People would not want to eat this because it does have a toxin as well. So this is not an edible plant. Pasque flower is one of the earlier spring bloomers, and it's a really, really beautiful one to photograph. We're going to come back through all these photos and kind of talk about photo techniques, but for now, we'll just kind of focus on the ecological story. Here, you might recognize this general plant family as being in the geranium family, and this is a sticky geranium. And before I go further, I'll put a disclaimer on this larger conversation. I bet that there are a lot of people on this call right now that have more botany knowledge than I do. And so I'll be looking forward to the questions at the end that'll help stump me along the way. This is really an intro to plants. I'm not a botanist. I approach it from a naturalist perspective, where I do have stories around the flowers and the plants that I have a knowledge around. And then there are so many people with really in-depth particular knowledge of all these things. So I'm excited to get to meet you at the end of the chat. The other thing that I am amazed by, this fact about sticky geranium is not known by very many people, at least that I've come across. And even in guidebooks, I'm amazed that not very many guidebooks talk about this quality of sticky geranium. But we know about like the Venus flytrap, right? That plants have the ability to trap and eat insects. And they do that by trapping the insect with some toxins or sticky substances that keep them in a vessel, and eventually they have this protein breaking down fluid that breaks down that insect, and then it makes it available as nutrients for the plant. Now, sticky geranium is actually one of those plants that can benefit from this. So the leaves and the stems of this plant are really sticky. They have these kind of Velcro-like hairs, and insects will get stuck to them, and then eventually they'll get broken down and the protein will get incorporated into the plant. So I'm not sure why more people aren't talking about this with sticky geraniums. I haven't known this all the time. I recently learned this, and I just think that's absolutely amazing. But this is a little bit of a later bloomer, maybe a late June into July, and then they'll bloom all the way through August into September. This one is not a photo that I took, but this is one of the smaller flowers in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, and they're called the spring beauty. And this one in particular is fascinating because in the base of the root, it's this large, large root that's actually called a corym. And that corym is a really starchy deposit that the plant stores a lot of sugars within. And that is a highly sought after food. And something that's truly amazing about bears in general in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is that they are opportunistic feeders. And so when something is available, they will almost exclusively feed on that until that food resource is gone. So you'll actually see grizzly bears and black bears cruising around the sagebrush flats, and they'll find a carpet of spring beauties, and they will just dig all of them up and eat the corum, the root, that starchy, kind of like a potato, but really small root system. So I always think it's this beautiful and kind of funny picture to be seeing these bears just rooting around and eating these flowers. And to give you a little scale, this kind of helps give you scale. That's 12-point font. This is a specimen mount that I made. But this flower is probably this, all 5 of those petals is probably as big as your thumbnail, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe even your, pinky nail. So these bears, you'll see them out feeding on these tiny flowers. Here's an example of bears feeding on an invasive species. So clover is invasive, white clover, and this is actually I took this in Yellowstone National Park. These bears were putting on a show on the side of the road, and they were just feasting on clover. And this species, while it is invasive, it's not one of the worst plant species. For instance, there are a number of plant species that biologists are actively trying to remove from Yellowstone National Park on the sides of the road. Um, and clover is not one that they're spending a ton of time on because it hasn't had huge negative impacts on the ecosystem. So it was pretty fun to watch this bear family take advantage of that carpet of clover. Another one that I really enjoy seeing is the green gentian, and this is also called a monument plant. And here we're only seeing this really small section of it. The flowers themselves are, half an inch across, and they have this really interesting structure, but it's built on this really large monument. And what's very particular about this plant is that they will put up leaves every year, and then when the conditions are right, they'll actually create this monument of flowers. And they only do that once in their lifetime, and it can happen anywhere from 20 to 60 years of age for that plant. And once they go to flower, then that individual is done and they've served their purpose. And so you'll see, it's pretty amazing because when the conditions are right, you might see a hillside that's filled with these monument plants. And it's just that the conditions were perfect that year for this plant to be able to take off and start reproducing. So that's a very fun one to look out for. And another one that has that plant structure where there are a lot of flowers off of one monument is lupine. And we talked a little bit about how soils are nutrient poor in Yellowstone National Park, Grand Teton, and the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And plants that are able to fix nitrogen are incredibly important for this ecosystem. So lupin is a nitrogen fixer, and what that means is that in the atmosphere, there's a lot of gaseous nitrogen, but hardly any plants can take that gaseous nitrogen and fix it into a compound that can then be used. But lupin, like many of the legumes, can do this, and it makes it available not only for lupin but also for surrounding plants. So just having lupin in the ecosystem helps to replenish nitrogen and soil, which helps to promote good soil health for the surrounding flowers as well. An interesting fact about this species, this is a picture I took in Iceland, is that it was used as erosion control. So it was introduced to Iceland as erosion control. And unfortunately, it has just taken over in this area. So it can be incredibly pervasive. It can be a huge carpet of lupin. And this is really beautiful, but there's a lot of debate about whether or not Iceland wants to try and eradicate this or remove it. It did do the job. It did help prevent erosion on hillsides by roads, but it's also taken over. So it's kind of interesting to see how in a different habitat, the same flower can be occupying a very different ecological niche. So the next flower we'll take a look at, and this is another big one in June. If you're in Grand Teton National Park in June, usually on the earlier side, but you can see it all the way through the end of June some years, is arrowleaf balsamroot. And this is in the Asteraceae family, and this is also incredibly important for indigenous peoples who would rely on this for a huge food source. So they'd eat just about every part of this plant. And you can identify it by taking a close look at the leaves. This isn't the best picture of it, but the leaves actually have kind of an arrowhead shape, and that's where it comes, the word arrowleaf comes from. And these just at a certain point in the year just blanket the entire valley floor. You'll see these in Yellowstone too, but just something about in Grand Teton, the expansive view, you can just see fields of yellow in some areas. Um, and the yeah, this is what I was going to show. So hopefully this video is going to play for you. This is the type of scene that you might be able to see if you're incredibly lucky. This was on a tour last year where we were able to see. This is actually a really famous bear, 399, with her single cub. And 399 is very famous because she's had a strategy to raise her young near roadways. And that's made her really famous because a lot of wildlife photographers have made their careers just following this bear and the young that she raises. But she's also famous because she typically has 3 or 4 or even more young cubs. And this year in particular, which was last year, she only had 1 cub. And talking with a lot of the folks who have spent a ton of time with her in the field, they were pretty interested to see how, with 1 cub, she's been much more involved with playing and romping with that cub. And in past years, the cubs kind of entertained each other and played around with each other. But as you're seeing in this video, it's pouring rain, and this was taken through a spotting scope with my cell phone. And it's a pretty spectacular scene with all the arrowleaf balsamroot just filling up the sagebrush flats. And you can see a little bit of purple there, which is the larkspur. But that's one of the really special things that can happen when you're in Grand Teton in June, especially, is when these wildflowers are carpeting the valley floor. And in this photo in particular, you're seeing actually some larkspur, the purple flower right at the base of the arrowleaf balsamroot, which is another one that you can see commonly in the valley. All right, so we're going to skip ahead here. This is another really fun plant to see. This is prairie smoke, also called old man's whiskers. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing what they look like when they go to seed. So we talked earlier about how do flowers reproduce? Are they wind pollinated? Are they pollinated by insects? This is an example of a structure that's evolved to help disperse the seeds by wind. And that's not the pollination cycle, but that's when it goes to seed, and then it's wind dispersal at that point. In the background of this shot, you're seeing some arrowleaf balsamroot as well. Let's see. This next one is one of my favorites. If you're in a conifer forest in late June, early July, you have a chance to be able to see one of these orchids. And this is a calypso orchid or a fairy slipper. Globally, we have more than 28,000 species of orchid. So it's a highly diversified species. And we were talking earlier about some plants go the generalist route, where they've evolved to be attractive to many different pollinators. But on the flip side, there are some flowers who have evolved on the specialist route. So they're trying to cater to, through the process of evolution and adaptations, to one particular organism. And in this case, there are bumblebees that pollinate this flower. But there's some discussion around this one in particular because There's some ideas that the nectar is not that beneficial, and it's not really offering that much to pollinators, and it's just mimicking other plants that are beneficial for pollinators. So there's some conversation about this one, but those kind of elk and deer, so they'll seek out this flower and eat it. It is edible as well, but don't take my word for it on any of these that I'm mentioning as edible. Here, this is scarlet. I'm not sure if it's Gilia or Hylia. I think it's Hylia. Someone will help me in the conversation at the end of this, but another one to look out for that is actually pollinated by hummingbirds. And you can see, once again, it's a specialist and it's adapted to have this really long tube. And if you think about a hummingbird's beak, they're able to reach their beak in, and they have an incredibly long tongue that extends beyond their beak to be able to reach the nectar at the bottom of that flower. All right, so here, if you want to, you can take a screenshot of this. It's pretty straightforward stuff if you want to just listen as well. So for photography, all these pictures that I've been sharing are ones that I've taken in the field, with the exception of the Spring Beauty picture. And a lot of the things that I'm thinking about when I do flower photography are just summarized by this list. So I'm really trying to do natural light. I find that it might be that I'm just not good enough at it. But when I introduce flash into the equation, it just ends up producing some really harsh images, and it doesn't always kind of feel like the moment. It's not as natural looking to me when I use flash. The other thing that I'm thinking about is using a macro lens, and a macro lens just allows you to focus incredibly close to the end of the glass, so you can get really, really close up for those details. And then using a really shallow depth of field so that the background is blurred out and you're just focused on the subject that you're looking at. Um, the biggest tip that I can give in terms of photographing flowers is to get low. You want to be on the ground. Almost all of these pictures, I'm laying on the ground to get down to the level of the flower, because if you are kind of pointed down at the flower, it just doesn't have the same composition. Um, Another thought is you don't have to have a macro lens, a dedicated macro lens. You can also do that same effect with a telephoto. So maybe a 200 millimeter lens, or maybe a little bit shorter you could get away with. That will do a very good job as well. And then be sure to, I even am at fault of this. I get really tied into the details and I kind of forget about the bigger scene. And so I really want to force myself to take a step back and get that wide angle shot. And on this shot in particular, I'm very, very close to that clump of flowers in the foreground. But with a wide angle, you're able to capture what's happening behind as well. Probably a 20 millimeter is going to give you something like that. With the telephoto lens, you're also able to start getting pictures of insects that are helping to pollinate. Here we have a hawkeye moth pollinating a flower. And so those are kind of some of the considerations. And just going back through this library that we shared from the beginning of the presentation, this picture in particular is an incredibly shallow depth of field, taken with a f-stop of 2.8 if you're thinking about that. And with flower photography, if you do want to start getting into aperture driven settings, you go to the A on most cameras, and that will help you select the aperture. And the smaller the number, the shallower the depth of field. So if you're down at like 2.8 versus 16, 2.8 is just put in focus a very small depth of field. The other thing that I'm thinking about, this is a hairy plant, right? And that can be challenging for photography. So another thing to think about is that your autofocus won't always do a great job here. So get it out of autofocus, get it into manual focus, rest your camera on the ground or use your elbows into your body to try and stabilize, and then use your manual focus ring and just watch until the point where you feel like the focus is in a good place. For this image, I had a few different images of this, and depending on where the focus is, it just might not feel right to you. And so everything is softened because of those hairs. And so you just want to play around with that to be able to get it to a place that you're happy with. Here, it was really important to me that the bottom petal with that water droplet was really perfectly in focus. And then to help tell the story of the leaves being sticky and where you have insects get stuck on them, and then the plant eats the insect, which is pretty amazing. If your mind isn't still blown about that, you know. So this photo, the focus was really important to be there, but it still bothers me a little bit that not all of the flower is in focus. So there are some strategies for that. You can change, again, the aperture, or you can start looking into focus stacking. And if you just YouTube focus stacking technique and then your camera model, I guarantee you'll come across a tutorial that will show you how to do that. There is a little bit of post editing where you have to stack all the focuses together to be able to create a crisp image, but that would be another way to approach this shot. I find that with flower photography, I'm often putting the subject dead center. This isn't something, this photo is really, for my purpose, is really to look at the structure of it. I want it to be a beautiful image, but I'm not really thinking artistically necessarily. I'm more thinking of it from a naturalist perspective, trying to document this plant and then talk about it. But you might want to play around with, what would this look like if you underexposed it so that just the flower itself, because it's lighter in color and it's got nice light on it right here. If you underexpose this image, the flower would be bright and then the background would darken. So that's something that I would think about on this. And then maybe getting away from putting it dead center would be nice as well. On this image, I took a number of pictures of this particular plant, and just figuring out where you like the focus is really important. And again, get out of autofocus, get into manual focus, and kind of slowly move through the scene as you're looking at it. Take a bunch of different pictures and then decide which of those you like the most. And sometimes when you get back to the computer, it might surprise you which one you ultimately pick. Just skipping through here. This is one of the very few where I followed my rule of don't always get lost in the details. Make sure you step back and get the broader scene. I think this one is really important to kind of capture the field of flowers. And again, I'm probably 1 foot away from that clump in the very, very front there to be able to get that as large as possible, but then also capture the background. And here on this one, this is another one where maybe if I were to go back, I would want to focus stack because I really want all the details of all the whole flower. But I really love the effect here with the shallow depth of field that it creates with the background just getting this really beautiful, it looks painted in the background. So that's accomplished by choosing the really, really wide open aperture, which is the small number, probably a 2.8 in this instance. And again, I didn't use flash here, and I think that was important because some of these structures of the flower, they're so translucent and some of them are white, you can just end up getting really big blowout areas and it just doesn't look right. So get a fast camera with a wide open lens and then see what you can grab. All right, so those are my photography tips, and then just moving over to how do you start to learn different flowers. For me, I never learn when I use my phone. It's awesome. I love the technology. It can help get you in the right area, at least down to the family. But I personally, with how my brain works, I have to either make a sketch or do a species preparation. If you ever get into like flower presses, that can be really fun. Just be really careful about where you're harvesting and where you're doing that to make sure it's not inside a national park. And then the other thing that can be helpful is just having a little book that you just write down what species you've seen. Just some kind of method to help get it into your brain and then practicing. So those are my tips for learning flowers. The other one that I'd throw in there as well is trying to learn some species names, which can actually have better clues about the flower itself than the common name. And the common name, you'll find that if you search pasque flower, for instance, it's going to come up with a lot of different flowers. But we're talking about one species in particular that lives in Grand Teton National Park. So if you learn some scientific names, it can be intimidating at first, but it can also be pretty satisfying too, the specificity that you get. And we hit on this already, but spring I think is just a beautiful time to visit if you're thinking about visiting Grand Teton and Yellowstone, because it's baby season. So you have baby elk, baby bison, and just all of the wildlife viewing opportunities are really amazing during that time of year. Possibly get to see wolf pups. So that late May, early June visit, if you're looking at trips, can be a really great time to be there. So just to wrap things up, if you were interested in traveling with Natural Habitat Adventures and World Wildlife Fund, the itinerary is a 7-day for the Yellowstone and Grand Teton Wildlife Safari. You start either in Bozeman or in Jackson, and it's a one-way trip. And it's primarily a wildlife trip. There are opportunities to do some botany and look around for flowers and be able to see a lot of other things, but part of the primary goal of this trip is to really get to see as much wildlife as possible. And we start in this particular itinerary, just to pick one, I started in Jackson, Wyoming. And that first day, we're doing a river float and seeing some incredible charismatic megafauna like this pronghorn. And then we make our way up to the geothermal features in Yellowstone National Park. And we have a day where we're exploring some geysers and hot springs and fumaroles and just some amazing geologic features. And then we spend some time in Hayden Valley, as well as some beautiful views of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And then we do spend 2 full days in Lamar Valley, which is really it's the northeastern section of the park, and it has the highest density of wolves. And so a lot of wildlife viewing up there, a lot of great opportunities to be able to see some of the species that you might not be able to see anywhere else. And finally, making our way up to Bozeman. So obviously that was an incredibly fast whip through tour of what it's like to be on the trip, but hopefully it gives you a little overview of the places you might see. It really is amazing. All of the guests that I've had the opportunity to guide are just really kind people who are united behind their interest in trying to preserve the places that they're visiting and learning about them. And that's just a really fun atmosphere to be in. And I've just been really grateful for all the people that I've gotten to meet guiding in these areas. So thank you so much for joining today. If you'd like to get in touch by email, you are welcome to, and you can also reach me on Instagram. And I'd encourage you to check out my website, twolined.com. And if you go to twolined.com/tracks, you'll be able to check out a lot of my work on northern peatlands, which is one of the most rare and vital ecosystems on our planet. And if you're happy with the webinar today, you can hear me again on March 5th and 14th. And like I mentioned in the beginning of this chat, we're going to take a look at our amphibian friends, and take a look at what we call the big night migration, when frogs, toads, and salamanders are making their way from the upland forests down into their ephemeral pools to be able to mate and then eventually return. So pretty amazing phenomena that occurs in a lot of places in North America. So thank you for tuning in today, and I have a couple minutes for questions.
Charlie, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I learned so much. We have time for questions. So I just want to remind everybody that they can submit their questions via the questions field in the control panel. Let's start with, can you remind us the names of the books that you recommended?
Yeah, so I better put it in the chat, but Wildflowers of Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks by Richard J. Shaw. Just gonna hold that up for a second. And the other one is by Kurt Johnson, A Far Country Field Guide. And this one is many more things than flowers, but it's kind of, to me, this is like the quick grab look at what's available and kind of identify things. And then if you want to go more deeply into the ecology of each thing, I didn't show this one earlier, but this is my absolute favorite. This is Daniel Matthews' Rocky Mountain Natural History. And this one is not quite, but it's almost a bedside table book where you could pick up a chapter, before you go to bed. It'll put you to sleep. Sometimes it's a little bit dry, but I do enjoy this one as well. And it gives you a lot more information than you might find in a couple of those other guides. So those would be my recommendations, but there are a ton of great books out there. And just about every gift shop in Jackson or Bozeman would be able to outfit you as well.
Excellent. Thank you. What are your settings on the photo of the yellow flowers with the mountain in the background where everything stayed in focus? Is that enough
Yeah,
information? Okay.
absolutely. I'd have to go back to the specific settings, but I remember that I did shoot, it's either f12 or f16, so you've got a really big depth of field all the way through. So we're talking about this image on the right top. And then the other thing that I did here is that this was just like really rare lighting for that area where the sun was coming out and it gave enough light in the valley for this to happen. So everything's in focus. I put the pinpoint focus on that clump of flowers in the front of the frame. And again, I was shooting with a 20 millimeter on this shot. So it was kind of this rare moment of really good light to be able to get something like this. But the other thing I did in post, in editing afterwards, is I created a filter over the top half of the image to brighten that up a little bit more. Because in the initial raw image, that was a little bit darker in the background. So this was kind of a combined circumstance of, it was just the right moment. And then I was trying to get that great depth of field, so at least f11 or f12. Yeah, just a lucky circumstance.
Luck and some good tricks. Um, what was the name of the sunflower type plant again? I believe they're referring to the yellow flowers there.
Yeah, that's the arrowleaf balsamroot.
Arrowleaf balsamroot. All right.
And there are a
Um,
couple of sunflowers that you can confuse it with, but once you look at the leaves and the way that it's all clumped together like that, it's a definite ID. Sorry, Sunny.
got it. No, no, thank you. Can you explain a little bit more about why the lupin is detrimental on mass? Um,
Oh
one
yeah.
viewer was told that in New Zealand, they were trying to eradicate them.
Yeah, so there was, we've, as a species, humans have introduced species all over the place where they aren't native. So the real issue is that where you find lupin in the wild, where it is native, it's evolved alongside other plants that occupy the same ecosystem. And they compete with one another, but in the same way, they also support one another. Like, we're learning so much more in ecology right now than we did in the last decades about how plant communities and animal communities are actually much more commensurate. They're helping one another more than they're competing in a lot of instances, which is pretty fascinating. But in this instance, what we're talking about in Iceland is that that species didn't exist there until we put it there. And because it didn't evolve alongside the plants in that ecosystem, it's able to outcompete anything in that area and just spread and take over. We also have the soils in Grand Teton National Park are pretty limiting nutrient wise, and it's a really harsh environment. Iceland is harsh, but it's not as cold, and it also has more nutrients in the soil because of the volcanic activity. Uh, and so the lupin is able to just take over in that instance. So it's just another example of plants getting introduced in areas where they weren't before and just outcompeting other species. So lupin in its native range is a positive thing. Lupin in an introduced area can become what we call invasive because it's detrimental to the ecosystem at large. Yeah,
Hmm,
good question.
interesting. Okay. Do you always shoot raw?
I do. The only time where I don't shoot raw is if I'm shooting for a client who I know is not going to blow the photo up or need to crop in. Um, I shoot raw because I'm editing all of my photos. So for those that don't know, raw is just a larger file format size. It captures a ton of information, but it requires you to process your images because it ends up shooting really flat and a lot of times flatter than real life. So if you shoot in raw, the color might not look as bright or vibrant or saturated. And so you have to bring that back in when you're editing the photo. When you shoot JPEG, it's already sharpening the pixels properly and saturating the photo properly based on what the camera saw. But when you shoot in RAW and edit in post, there's a lot more ability to adjust the color to because sometimes the camera is not reading the situation correctly and you have to get rid of some green or add some magenta to be able to get it back to what you remember. So for me, I'm always shooting raw, but it does mean that you're ending, especially with new gear right now, you have huge files that you're managing, and you know, I'm glad to have the flexibility for it in my library, but at the same time, it's a ton of file management.
Hmm.
So good question.
Well, that is the last question we have time for today. So I'll turn it back to you for closing comments.
All right, well, thank you for tuning in, and feel free to shoot me an email to tell me what you thought. And take note that I'll be talking about amphibians March 5th and 14th. We'll talk about big night migrations and what you can do to help support it and make sure that these creatures are getting to their pool party on time. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.
Awesome. I look forward to that one. I want to thank everybody who tuned in and for submitting your fabulous questions. Please join us again tomorrow for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, we'll conclude the webinar. Have a wonderful day, everyone.